Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here, and we've got a special show for you today. It's a big treat for me because we have a special guest that I've been following for a few years now, and I've had a real interest in getting to know. But I'm going to let him introduce himself in just a moment. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest. I'm at my place in New England today. I kind of go back and forth across the country to each of my homes. But anyway, I'm here today. And it's really kind of fun to be here today because the person we're talking to, I purchased some of his art, and it's actually right around me right now. So it wouldn't be the case if I was out west. But anyway, I've written some books, and one of those books is In the House of Tom Bombadil. Hey, Tom, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Tom Price. I teach systematic theology, ethics, and philosophy, and one of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and I, too, am in New England, not far from Chris.
Right. We're actually getting together for dinner tonight with our wives.
That's right.
All right. Glenn.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and a ministry-associated Reflections Ministries. I am not close to Tom and Chris. I'm about 800 miles away in northern Indiana.
Well, it's great to see you, Glenn. And our guest today is even further away or farther away from us than you are. Jack, please introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Jack Baumgartner, and I'm in Kansas, South Central Kansas. So closer to Indiana, I guess.
Right. Well, let me just give some folks a little bit of background on you. As far as I know, anyway, Jack is a farmer. He has a farm there in Kansas, but he's also an accomplished musician, visual artist, furniture maker, woodworker, puppeteer. I mean, the list goes on and on. But Jack, in spite of all of his accomplishments, is a very humble and very self-effacing guy. So kind of getting him to talk about this stuff, I imagine, makes him a little uncomfortable. But he loves the Lord, and we're really glad that he can be with us today to talk about his work. And like I said, I've had an interest in Jack for a while. I was actually introduced to his work by Susanna Black Roberts now, but she sent me a note one time and she said, "You got to check this guy out, Jack Baumgartner." And so I think she gave me a link to the article on you in Image Magazine. And maybe they did something on your work in Plow. I don't remember if they did or not, but Susanna was an editor at Plow, and I think she still has some ongoing, connection there. But I was introduced to your stuff by her, and I said, "Man, this guy is great. I got to check out, whether or not I can actually get a hold of some of his stuff." And sure enough, I've got some of your prints, one of which is right behind me there around the wall. And we're going to talk a little bit about that one in a few minutes. But anyway, Jack, I thought today we could kind of go through the various media that you are working in, but maybe start off with the farm.
Yeah.
So we've got some images that accompany the show today, and if you're not watching on YouTube or on Spotify and just are in your car listening to the podcast, I encourage you when you get home to look up the show on either Spotify or YouTube because of the images that we're going to be talking about today. But anyway, tell us a little bit about the farm.
Sure. It's a pretty small farm, especially by Kansas standards, and a little unorthodox, but there's more people doing these kinds of things, it seems like now. But yeah, so we have we own about 40 acres, and then we lease probably another 100 acres. And we raise grass-fed lamb, and we have a goat dairy operation where we just hand milk, 6 to 8 goats a year, and sell the milk. In Kansas, it's actually legal to sell raw milk, so we sell raw goat's milk, which this year,
Nice.
It's been a big deal this year. We've sold lots and lots of milk this year, which has been kind of interesting. But we have a lot. We sell eggs. We raise chickens and turkeys, and some pigs, and we have some cows. So it's kind of an old, more of a traditional, maybe homestead type of
Yeah, it kind of sounds something along the lines of stuff that Joel Salatin talks about. Are you familiar with Joel Salatin? Is that name ring a bell?
I am familiar with Joel Salton. He's a neat voice for some of the, even just the methods that I try and use. He's a good voice for this kind of model of, I get regenerative agriculture is a big word right now. And people like Joel and Gabe Brown are really, powerful voices in that movement. And it's a really significant, people like him who take stewardship really seriously. Which is we could have a huge conversation about stewardship.
Oh yeah.
But
maybe we'll have you back on the show sometime when we have Joel, because actually we're like 1 degree separated from Joel. A good friend of Joel is a good friend of mine, a guy named John Moody, and he's in Kentucky. That's another topic for another day. But maybe we'd have you come back and talk a little bit about that. But I think one of the things that's really cool about the farm is you got kids,
yes,
and your wife, and I imagine everybody's involved in making the farm go. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, everybody's involved. It's funny. My wife and I have these conversations, usually at least once a year, and sometimes really big, these evaluative conversations of like, okay, what are we doing here? And is the direction that we've set off in, is this good, especially in light of raising kids, and, there's a lot of sacrifices that we've made to have the farm, agriculture, especially the way we're doing it, is not hugely profitable, and especially when I'm, when it's not the main. I kind of have a governor that I've put on it too, because if I go too far, then all of a sudden I'm not painting and I'm not building, I'm not doing all these other things. So I've kind of had this little bit of a governor built into it. So we have these conversations about that, and I think one of them is, well, we don't go on vacation. We don't. She's a pastor, actually, and a hospice chaplain, and so another highly lucrative profession that you can put in there with artists.
That's right. That's right. It's interesting how these highly lucrative professions kind of are drawn to each other.
Yeah, I know. We always laugh because my little sister is a lawyer and her husband is a car salesman. So we about that.
Yeah. Right. So clearly, there's a theological and sort of spiritual sort of outlook that informs everything and kind of holds it together.
Yeah.
And we love to get into that too. But the fact that your kids are working with you, I think, is actually something that a lot of our listeners will really admire and wish could be the case in their own lives.
Yes.
It's really a throwback to the way households worked in the past, from the start.
Yeah.
And here we got, some pictures of, I think it's a couple of your boys, maybe.
Yeah. That's my oldest son in the cowboy hat right there. He's running a sawmill. And one of my younger sons is kind of helping him out. It's.
So how many kids do you have, Jack?
I have 6 kids.
Great.
Yeah. They range from, the oldest is 16 and the youngest is a year and a half. So it's a big deal to me to have them being a part of what I do, and to be able to be around them in all these capacities. My oldest son, and then I have a daughter, and then another son, and the two older boys, they help me with all the chores in the morning right now. And I'm often out there thinking how many people I know would give anything to be able to have that kind of time every single day with their kids, where you're just working together and being a part of that kind of, cadence. I almost think of it as almost like a ritualistic kind of cadence, where they're, because you're doing the same thing every day, but there's an intention behind it, and for us too, it's that, being a part of stewardship, it's that very first kind of like injunction from God in the beginning to take care of life, and it's that's, to me, that's so important. And when you ask me about like the farm, kind of the beginning of the farm in a way is like that is probably, if I were to kind of like essentialize that motivation in a way, it's like how there's something in me that I have to take care of living things, whether it's sheep or the beyond just, there's my kids, and we always had raised animals and stuff growing up, and we lived rurally, but my dad was a roofing contractor, and my mom was a English professor, but we always had, animals, but there was something in me that was like, there was a separation of from like just kind of having animals as pets versus having animals that feed people, or that produce fiber or all those different things. So there's something that's really meaningful to me about that,
Yeah. You're talking about the difference between, recreation and productivity. And I think that one of the things that we've lost is the fact that when we have meaningful work to perform with our kids, it goes a long way toward really strengthening the relationship. When it's kind of funny when you make the relationship the point, you kind of lose the point. But when you have another point, the relationship has some kind of context. So, for example, all three of my kids are grown. My oldest son is Caleb, and he works with me every week on this podcast. And so it gives us something to work together on. Now, I'm curious, just from the standpoint of your daily routine and where things go.
Yeah.
There's a marvelous book that was published a number of years ago called Daily Rituals, where it analyzed the daily routines of people like Mozart and Kierkegaard and so forth, sort of breaking up their day. And this is when they did their creative work. This is when they did other things. Right. What's your typical day look like?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know if you can hear my sons over there in the shop right now, banging and sawing. If it gets too loud, let me know.
That's good.
I can read.
No, that's fine. We like that.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's part of the atmosphere of the place. I'm usually there's roosters or something crowing in the background too. But it's, so that's kind of the big dance is getting getting through the day. And I get up usually around 4 or 4:30, and I come out here to my studio, and usually to get a few hours of work, painting usually. And it's also just kind of, it's painting is, I could get off on a rabbit trail. Well,
we're going to be looking at some of your paintings in a minute, so we can get on that rabbit trail a little later.
Sure. Yeah. So I spend some time painting, and it's, it's kind of like a quiet time. It's really, nobody's up yet, so it's just it's a very important part of my day so I've been doing that for couple of decades, and then I transition into, once the sun starts coming up, we transition into doing chores, So depending on the time of year, that they can, sometimes they're an hour, sometimes they're 2 hours, sometimes it can fill the whole morning, just depending on what's going on seasonally on the farm. But usually there's, a lot of animals to feed. And then after that, then I kind of transition into just working either in my studio again, depending on what the work is, and then or in the workshop. So the kind of the middle part of the day is given to that, and then if my wife's home or not, I make lunches and take care of kids. We homeschool, so the nice thing about the kids now age kind of gap is the older ones are really good at taking care of the younger ones. So there's a lot of,
that's great.
It works out well, and I'm here, so that sometimes the shop will be full of kids, working and playing around, or sometimes they'll be doing their schoolwork. So that can ebb and flow, and then usually around 4 in the afternoon, 4:30, as I transition into doing the evening chores, and then we, then kind of depending on the work, sometimes I'll work in the evening out in the shop. Sometimes we'll be in the house. It just kind of depends, but that's kind of the main breakup of the day.
Yeah. And I imagine that the kids can kind of get access to you as they need throughout the course of even your are there ever periods of time where it's like, hey, I'm really into something right now and it can't be interrupted? Or is that just unrealistic?
It's sort of unrealistic. Part of the reason I picked Wednesday to talk with, Wednesday worked great to talk to you guys, is my 3 younger kids when we bought some more land, a few years ago, we built a house for my mom and dad. So they actually live
nice.
On our farm too. So the 3 younger ones, on Wednesdays, they get to spend a day with their grandparents. So it's
nice.
Wednesday is always kind of a nice day for productivity, because I don't get nearly as many interruptions, but it's one of those things where, you rue it and you just delight in it at the same time, So I'm always, it's always one of those, I'm trying to get something done, but at the same time, and so I thank God for that, because I think they really kind of bring what I would almost call like an atmosphere of rest, into daily life, because they just, they don't care if I'm getting anything.
That's right. Yeah, Dad's just Peyton. We can interrupt him.
That's right.
But they come out and have these great commentaries, so too, insights.
Well, that's fun. That's fun. Hey, let's jump into some things here.
Sure.
I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of themes that I know run through a lot of your work, and one of them is walking on. And I think that this connects to a statement or a kind of a motto: "Go on."
Yeah.
So, can you give us a little bit of background on this? Because I listened to another interview with you where you were actually talking a little bit about maybe your own development as an artist and how it relates to this.
Yeah, there's a Brigham Young University TV has a series that they call Artful, which is they feature artists with a faith background, and so they actually came out this spring and with a film crew, and it was a pretty neat experience. Actually, it was one of those I didn't know what to expect, and but they did what blew me away. I'm just amazed at that, humbled and honored again, by how they told that particular story of where Go On came from. But yeah, that both Walking Man and Go On come from when I was still in school. in Kansas City. There's an art institute in Kansas City that I went to for a few years. I went to a local community college, and then transferred there. Go On came at kind of a crisis of my time there, really struggling with depression and also, I guess it's a term new to me, but I've heard it now a lot. Imposter syndrome, I think,
I've heard the term. Sure, yeah.
I don't, I don't belong here. I don't deserve to be here, and so I had this. I've always been sort of slightly obsessive personality, so I would, I had to work harder than anyone, when I was at school, and just because I didn't feel like I deserved to be there. So, and anyways, it's a long story, but there just came to a point where, I really was worn out and overwhelmed and had all these kind of, just strong, I would almost call them panic attacks, and these just moments of paralysis where I just would I couldn't move, I couldn't, I had reasoned in my brain in myself into these just being utterly paralyzed and, terrified of, moving forward. Or anyways, it was, so the crisis came in the middle of the night, and I was just laying in my studio space at school, just kind of crying out. And I didn't know, I didn't know what to do. And that was his voice. It was as close as I've ever experienced an audible voice of God, just saying, "Go on." And I always marvel at how much quality was in that voice, in that statement of both how much love and encouragement and tenderness there was in it, but there was a lot of force, and it was a pretty serious word too. It wasn't like,
right.
I mean, I felt all of it, I felt
right. Yeah. It reminds me of that scene in Disney's, animated film Bambi, where Bambi's father, who is this magnificent stag, and the forest is burning all around them, and Bambi has collapsed, and his father just says, "Get up."
Yeah.
Get up.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
That's pretty great. So yeah, it's a lot. It was a lot like that, and I think what it was, in all the years I've had to reflect on that, and how it's kind of become just my motto in a lot of ways. It's really, there was no answers or resolution to any of the problems that I was facing, and it was, and I've always sort of equated it. I think a lot of, when Jesus asked the disciples, are you guys going to leave me too?
Yeah.
And they just are like, where else would we go?
That's right.
And so
right.
Loyal despair.
We don't know what to do, but we don't have anywhere else to go at this point. So that's what
we're all in. We're all in. But one of the wonderful things about the images of Walking Man is how you've blended in certain features. I know that sometimes Walking Man has oak leaves for hands or tree roots for feet.
Yeah.
Here we have horns on his head and a tree growing out of the back of his boat.
Yeah.
this marvelous stuff going on. So. Can you get into that a little bit? Because your work is suffused with symbolism, and in a way that I think is not necessarily kind of immediately understandable to
Right.
maybe people who are out of touch with the symbols you're working with.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Kind of basically like to start with Walking Man in general, is that when I first started drawing him, years and years ago, and I always thought of him as, he obviously looks a lot like me. So there's definitely a self-portrait kind of dynamic there, but I always really intended the idea of an everyman character at the same time, something that, was a vehicle for, to explore, all these things I was wrestling with and am wrestling with, as an individual, but also as, maybe an ambassador for, humanity at the same time, the everyman. And there's some great, I being a student of art history, there's a lot of, in literature too, there's a long precedent for everyman characters. And even my name, I guess, Jack, is sort of goes along with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jack and the Beanstalk,
Yeah,
all that
all
kind of
these
stuff.
Jack
Right?
stories out there, and so, so at some point, about 10 years ago, so he was always, a lot of it was just walking and, he's the main character in my puppet theater as well. And so he's working out my salvation in a way. Because art for me always, in these drawings, is always like, I have all these questions for God. And so it's like these big, all these dialogues of like, well, what does this mean? Or why am I feeling this way? Or what's the story? Or like, I feel really good when I'm in this context. So I'm going to draw Walking Man in this context because, or I only, prayer became like walking became this sacred time. I lived as a hermit in southeastern Kansas for about 4 years.
Oh, wow.
And I lived in a little cabin with no electricity or running water. And so every afternoon, evening, when towards the end of the day, people call it the golden hour, but I've always called it the golden corridor. But I would always start. I would walk. Sometimes I would walk all day long. There were the land where I lived bordered on. There was nobody out there. It was just all these big ranches that, and then there was some public ground. So I could walk for, miles and miles without seeing anybody.
Yeah, I've been to Kansas. I know exactly what you're talking about.
So I would walk this time of day, and it became like, I sort of made an agreement. I came to an understanding that I could trust the thoughts that he gave me when I was walking. It was one of those, I don't know how to explain it very well, but it just became, when sometimes it's hard to sort out those voices is this just me? Or is it from where's,
there's a saying in the history of philosophy, and I can't recall its Latin, but basically to be solved by walking.
Right.
So there's this kind of peripatetic character to many of the philosophers, everybody from obviously Aristotle to Immanuel Kant, guys just walking all the
time. It's also Malcolm Guite, who is a theologian and poet and musician, does most of his prayer walking.
Okay.
He says he takes 3 walks a day. Uh-huh. And that's when he gets his inspiration for his poetry and a whole lot of other things, as well as his like I said, his prayer life, his connection to God.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. Malcolm, how do you spell his last name?
It's
Guite.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you really like him. If you're into Coleridge, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner and all that kind of stuff, he wrote a marvelous treatment of that poem, that epic poem, and at the same time use it to analyze Coleridge's life.
All right.
So Guite is a really interesting guy. I think you'd really get into him.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to look into him.
I wanted to also note that when you talked about kind of being a hermit for a while, I something I know is just studying the history of theology is that there is a whole tradition of monastic tradition, but a lot of the kind of life of prayer and creativity were found as people devoted themselves to that kind of intimate communal life where they're learning to discern through their walk with God those aspects that I think heighten those aspects of their creativity and their intellect to think clearly and see clearly. And I think has always been a kind of spiritual connection with the arts in that way, traditionally. And sometimes I think that's been eclipsed in our, contemporary world in many cases. So I was just kind of curious how you found that kind of walking and that communing, inspirational to the creative process. And if you get away from it, do you see a loss?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's so many things that, as far as like the creative process, that was that time, reflecting on that time, and where I had a certain degree of freedom and space to just really walk and it was, it's sort of been replaced by other things now, I would say, almost just some of the agricultural endeavors, and even labor itself. You bring up the monastics, and that's another big influence on how I kind of view work in general, especially like some of the Trappist ideas of work as prayer, and Brother Lawrence is another very significant influence on me and how I think about work and prayer and the presence of God and all that, and it's interesting in terms of like creativity. Sometimes I think it's when I study the like contemplatives, I'm never able to kind of engage even like ritual, there's always these disconnects where I have such a deep regard and appreciation, but I can never access it in the same way that it's kind of being narrated or written out. And with maybe Brother Lawrence would be the closest exception, but I think especially contemplative, where I've recognized that, like walking was a form of contemplation, and so, but labor itself has become such it fills that meditative space.
This is a good segue to actually get into your work a little bit. So we're going to kind of walk through some things. We're going to look at your prints first, then we're going to get to your paintings. And I want to make sure that we move on also to your woodworking and furniture before we're done. But why don't we talk about the printmaking process? It might be good to get this print that's right behind me up on screen here. It's entitled The Spiritual Mechanics of Labor and Rest. Uh-huh. And that title fascinated me, but also the contents of the image are also worth thinking about. There's a lot of detail in the print. Before we actually started recording, you described a little bit of the process in terms of how these prints are made. Yeah. And can you just do a little bit of background on that for us?
Yeah. For the one in question, is, it starts out as a drawing essentially. And then, I've got a block right in front of me here, actually, a piece of linoleum that I've laminated to half-inch birch plywood, so it's nice and stable. So I'm actually drawing out, working on a block right now. So I transfer the drawing onto the block. Sometimes I'll just redraw it. Other times I'll, if I have a really good drawing that I want to work with, I'll scan that drawing and then scale it up and print it out on multiple sheets of paper, and then use carbon paper even to transfer it onto the block.
Yeah. Being
careful to reverse it too, because everything's like lettering and everything is, a mirror image. And so I've learned to be really, I use a lot of text in my prints often, and I've often got letters backwards in spite of checking multiple times. So it's kind of like, how did I miss that? So then it's just a long process of carving. Here's some of the tools that I use, actually. Just a bunch of, these are Japanese tools. So they're just, the handles are really, they're just kind of an oval shape, but they're really, for the way I work there, I like these quite a bit. You can hold them almost like a pencil. And the main ones I use are a small little knife. It's like called a skew. So it's just like a flat chisel at an angle instead of straight across. And then a small V gouge. And then so I just, the knife, the knife is really kind of the key to the detail work. It's sort of like a scalpel. And so I can draw with it and just and get in there and release the shapes and stuff like that. When I used to just work with a V gouge, and when I started using a knife, the amount of detail that was readable, I'd try and put detail in, and maybe like 75% would be readable, So it was kind of fun to start using that knife and realize how much more was possible.
So what drew you to printmaking? I mean, when there's drawing and then there's printmaking, what was sort of the thing that created the transition for you? Was it always something you wanted to do?
I started doing it. I think I did a few when I was in high school. There's actually when I went to high school, there was a kid that transferred from I think he came from Tulsa, Oklahoma or something like that. And he was doing all these block prints when he came, and nobody in my class was doing block prints, and they were great. They were these really such a strong, neat, really strong images. That black and white is a really powerful force, and just reads differently than, a spindly kind of line drawing, which is, my drawings are always these kind of really spidery affairs. But so I was fascinated then, and then throughout, my education and learning more about the tradition of block printing, there's such a rich tradition, and so many amazing images out there. And I love how, especially like medieval block prints, and they have these great ways of like, there's all these great prints of, say, John the Baptist baptizing Christ, and the water is just, it's very stylized. There's no effort at trying to make something realistic. But it ends up being these there's so much rhythm and movement. And I think too, one of the things I love about printmaking, is I think there's just something fascinating to me about making a line indirectly. It's like going to all this effort to carve all this stuff away just to make a line, you know? And that line is so different than if you were to just draw it with a pen. It's because there's all this energy concentrated around it. And you can feel that. And I like copper engraving. I don't think I sent you any copper engravings, but they're copper engraving where you're actually, you know, carving a line in a copper plate, and then instead of, you know, a relief print where everything you carve away is white and everything that's left is black. In a copper engraving, you're actually carving, it's the opposite. So you carve into the plate and you put the ink on and you wipe all the ink away except for what's in the lines. And then you press the paper into that. And the line quality of a copper engraving is just, to me, is like there's nothing else I've ever seen like that, especially in the hands of somebody who is really good at it. And Dürer is, you know, Albrecht Dürer is that's kind of the German master. And but there's, you know, I'm when I lived in Denver, while my wife was in seminary, I did some copper engravings when I was up there, and I didn't have a press at the time. And so I found an open press in town that a guy ran. And he taught me a lot of techniques and stuff for printing, but he made, you know, it was one of those, I showed up with these plates that I'd engraved, and he's like, "Oh, you're one of those guys," you know? And he said, I have to show you some copper engravings by this. And I think he was a Central American printmaker, but he lived in Denver, and I can't remember his name, which I deeply regret, because the prints that he showed me, they were all these engravings of gourds that this guy had done. And I've never seen so much the line quality, you know, because the line could be so descriptive of, and you know, where it goes from thick to thin, and it can just build these beautiful forms. I've never seen anything like this guy's engravings. I just think he even surpassed Dürer, in my opinion, and I don't even know his name.
Let's dip into this a little bit, because this is intriguing to me, and for a range of reasons. One is there's a lot of physical strength, I imagine, that's required in order to actually do the engraving work, the cutting away. And then there's the endurance,
right?
You know, your hands and your forearms must really take, a lot of, I guess, stress, you know, when you're working with. And then there's the quality of the material you're working with. This is one of the things that I think that people who don't work with their hands can't fully appreciate, because there are lots of people who do work with their hands, but maybe who cannot communicate verbally what they're really understanding from working with the material, what they're learning, you know, about really creation itself when they're actually working with material. If you spend your entire day in a cubicle and just typing, you know, on a computer, you're not actually engaging in dimensions of reality that a person like yourself, as a farmer and artist, are exposed to every day. And I think there's a wisdom that can only be acquired through engaging with the physical world and the creative process that you're in, you know, working in. But do you have any thoughts on any of that stuff?
Well, it's interesting. Like the material, there's an author that I like, William Bryant Logan is his name, and he's an arborist in New York, and he's written a lot of neat books. But someday he uses this term, and I don't know if he originated it or where it's coming from, and I don't even. It's fascinating. He calls them the resistant materials, and and so like this whole idea of like what you're describing, you know, there's these resources that we work with, whether it's soil or wood or metal. There's that resistance that's built in. You know, and it's kind of obviously right. There's a spectrum to that, which you can really go down, into nuance, especially like with metalwork, for example, and it's fun watching. My oldest son he's been doing a lot of, it's one of the things that he's really been drawn into is blacksmithing. And,
oh, nice.
So he had a big chunk of old bush hog blade that he was annealing, so he had got it really hot. And you kind of get it hot enough to where it loses its magnetic properties. And then you put it in some ashes, bury it in ashes. And then, so that insulates it and it allows it to cool down really, really slowly. And it just relaxes all the molecules in that high carbon steel. So I love watching him learn that stuff, but this idea of the resistant materials is really fascinating to me in the sense of, I lack, I'm not a wordsmith, but, when I think about what God set out to do, or when I wonder, that invitation to engage with all this stuff, it seems so significant to me. That level of cooperation and resistance, it's not the same thing. Like you mentioned, people in a cubicle, it's very different from typing on a computer and working with something that's meant to interface with you and respond like that, and how I laugh at myself, even like with my phone, like how quickly I can get impatient with something that doesn't.
Well, me too.
I catch myself doing it. I think this is absurd. It's a miracle that it's responding to me at all. But then to be able to work with these materials and that I don't know, it's almost a mystery to me. I wish I could talk about it better, because it's something that I think about so much and is fascinating to me.
Well, let me propose a couple of thoughts. One is that when you're engaged in the kind of work you're engaged in, Jack, there's a kind of wisdom that's being developed that's doesn't have currency. In other words, you can't just talk about it and somebody else gets it. If you know what I mean. So I was talking about this idea with somebody the other day. I was like, okay, I know my wife, but that has no currency. But I can say to a person, my wife loves chocolate. That has currency. They can understand that. They can go and buy her some chocolate now. But in the sense that the relationship I have with her is something that can't be sort of transferred. It's non-transferable. It's just something that exists between us. And that's kind of the thing that I think occurs when you're engaged with physical work, with the created order. God is actually communicating to you through these things in ways that are I guess they don't have currency. They don't, they just can't create abstractions, with words and then just pass them on. You just have to do it. You're not going to get it unless you actually try to work with that copper plate.
It is interesting that aspect of it that isn't transferable. That's because, I have the experience. I can give somebody the artwork, but I have that experience of that intimacy of working with the materials, wrestling through the concepts, all the self-doubt of whether it's worth it or not,
right.
And things like that. And that is, in a way, it's not transferable en masse, and maybe that's the beauty of having my kids around. There's these levels where it is transferable, begins to be transferable in that way, because it's just something that I can only sort of make it available to them. At least that's my personal kind of belief, is that it's an invitation. And there's, what you described too, I think of as like, I always call it a principle of apprenticeship, where there's a level where you can explain things, and say, so when you're doing this, this is what this is going to be like. There's no way you can understand it. And you're only going to understand it 15 years from now. And you'll remember this conversation when you experience it. So I can kind of prepare you and talk about like these different things, but someday you're going to be doing this work, and all of a sudden this lesson, like that harmony or that thing that's like the wisdom, the thing that's stored in your hands and not in your head, or the thing, all these other memories that aren't mental memories. All of a sudden those things will all respond, and then it'll make sense.
Well, you know what I'd like to do at this point, Jack, because, we're well into the show and there's so much we could be, looking at right now. What I'd like to do is kind of cycle through a few things, just kind of, quickly. So now we're looking at your paintings. So I'd like to just kind of flip through those a little bit. And if there's anything in particular you want us to stop and address, like this particular image, is this from a triptych? Is this, because I know you have panels, the triptych, you've got, generally 3 panels carved, framed and kind of hinged together. But you've got Walking Man above, and then below, that's the great fish, and that's Jonah, isn't it?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
I that just blew me away, that fish. I want you to tell you. I love that fish. This is just a marvelous image. But anyway, can you talk a little bit about your painting?
Yeah. Well, this painting in particular, obviously there's Walking Man. Jonah is probably, and after Walking Man, he's probably the next most sort of repeated character that I tend to work with. That's an older paint. I did that one in school, actually, where Jonah's sitting overlooking Nineveh after going through the city. And but yeah, that one is, I have a lot of, I think about Jonah a lot, and I always kind of think that he gets, it's easy to kind of cast aspersions on Jonah for all the things that he maybe did wrong. But I think he's such a remarkable character, and I look at how God dealt with him, and there seems to be it seems to be a pretty close relationship that they have. You look at some of the other prophets from that area, you read like in Kings and Chronicles, and if a prophet did like one thing wrong, they were devoured by lions or something like that. I guess Jonah, he
puts up with Jonah. Right?
So,
well, I'd like to get into that image though, because there are a couple of things. One is I love the vibrancy of your color, but also the mouth and what appears to be like hair. On the fish. What was going on with it? Do you just kind of proceed by like a feel like I want my tongue on this fish to be like flames of fire? Is there, what's going on with some of that?
There's some other paintings I've done, a lot of the paintings I've done of Jonah the whale, often there's some sort of fire or light coming from the mouth of the whale. And one of the things that I think I've always really tried to do when I think about art, that's an old one. It's probably one of my favorite Jonah ones I've ever done. It's such a funny little painting, but when I think about the spirit, like I think we talk about things of the spirit and things that are natural, this, charismatic movement talks about the spiritual realm and the natural realm or whatever. And there's always this, I think there's this part of me that's, that divide that came about, is really kind of a false divide. Just,
I agree with you.
so it's like these things are one.
Yeah.
And so I've always really struggled, and that's you talked about some of the symbolism with Walking Man and the horns, and that's a lot of what's going on there too, is that, where is trying to, how do I make art about this, because I have, I don't have the same boundary, I can break boundaries in that way, because, there is a boundary, there is the seen and the unseen. There's things that we see with our eyes and things that we don't see with our eyes. So I'm really interested but it's not, obviously not the same thing as, it's not that everything unseen is spiritual and everything you see is natural. Right. So,
right.
But so with the whale there, it's a portal in a way, and in a lot of senses, that's, on one level, it's a portal to the underworld where he writes that crazy poem, about being at the roots of the mountain. And, and so there's this idea of like it's in a funny way, it's like Moses being hidden in the rock and the glory of God passing by him. It's that same type of fire.
We're dealing with the sublime.
Mm-hmm.
There's, when we think of the whale, it's at one and the same moment, judgment and mercy,
right?
Because it preserves Jonah's life, but it's also not a very pleasant experience.
Yeah.
So I'd like to move on, if you don't mind, Jack, because this is really rich stuff. But I would like to get into your woodworking too. I mean, you've got some marvelous stuff that you've done, like this table, wood slab table. There's in the course of your furniture making, then there's this marvelously crafted. What would you call that? Vase?
Yeah, I always just call them hollow vessels or something like that. But yeah, it's sort of.
Did you turn that?
Yeah, that's turned on a lathe, and it's hollow, so the walls are really thin, and it's
wow.
Like I would say maybe 1 out of 3 of those that I try and turn, I break.
I bet. I bet.
So,
but you've got a range of things. You got everything from carved wooden spoons of different sizes, and so this marvelous bedroom set. Is that walnut?
Yeah, that's walnut. That's all native stuff. All the wood. I do a lot of the furniture. I do is my best friend does. We work together on a lot of that stuff. I do most of the building, and construction of it, but we mill a lot of the wood together. And so,
yeah, I saw the sawmill that you had there a little while back. Yeah.
So we over the years we've worked together for so long, and so he a lot of the design. So a lot of the genesis of the designs come from him, and then we work kind of refine them together, and so there's a neat, it's kind of fun to be able to build furniture and have a real kind of consistent relationship with the materials. Know where they came from, and know the story behind each sort of tree.
So did you mill that walnut?
Yes, sir. Yeah, this the back piece, sort of the backboard of that particular one, is the same tree, also of that headboard of the bed. So they go together, and
gotcha.
The trees all the wood that for this came from kind of 3 different places. One came from a river valley near the town of Augusta, and the big tree, this walnut tree, got uprooted, and it just kind of sat for a long time, being suspended in the air by its roots and by the crown of the tree. And actually, the guy, my son told me a guy was here a little bit ago. That guy actually and a friend of his salvaged it and brought it to me and asked me if I would mill it for him. And I just started looking at it, and I also have the roots to it. Also, the roots are incredible. So I've got those.
Yeah.
You should see my yard; it's insane.
Yeah, I bet.
But
well, this is really, and then I see the butterfly joinery there that kind of is intended to help to stabilize some things.
Yeah.
And then you got some great dovetailing there.
Tails and
this is great stuff, Jack. That's kind of a harvest table, it looks like.
Yeah.
Now, this particular cabinet has got a lot of fine work on the surface.
Yeah.
So you've gone from a very kind of rough, natural approach with slabs to something here much more, worked and kind of made civilized.
That was a very, very challenging job. There's actually two cabinets, and they're in a bathroom of a Japanese American couple, and this bathroom is just designed to, every aspect of it is just super considered, and so they wanted these cabinets, and so they're actually, all those designs are, we built did all shops on veneer and made our own plywood to build this with. And so I essentially ebonized the walnut, where you can utilize a chemical reaction between iron oxide and the tannins in the walnut, and it turns it black on the surface. And then I carved through the surface. So all the carvings are basically, the wood underneath is the lighter part that you're seeing. Right. So it had a really kind of subtle, it was just a neat effect. It was, all the cabinets on all the sides have all those carvings all over them. And, it was a neat job.
Yeah, we're going to kind of wrap things up here, Jack. This has been a marvelous conversation. I've enjoyed it immensely. Is there anything maybe that you sent us in way of an image that we want to maybe end on? Is there something that you want to talk about?
Well, let's go back to the spiritual mechanics of labor and rest. Print.
I'd like to do
there in your studio.
Right.
And I think, if anything, when I made this, that kind of piece probably sums up a lot of what we talked about, or a lot of, every once in a while I get to these points where I think I need a way to catalog, or I need something to hold all this stuff, and that's kind of the name of my website is The School of the Transfer of Energy. And it was it came about as a similar kind of thing of like, where do I put all this, in terms of a thought form or something along those lines. And so this is a similar thing where it's like, there's all these thoughts about labor and agriculture and art and tools and materials and frequency and the unity of the spiritual and natural, that these things are all in relationship and all have something to say about God, and all have something to say about the meaning of my life in a way, and how do I at this stage in my journey, how do I catalog all of that, if that makes sense?
It does. And it's a very, very meaningful piece for me. I collect your work, Arthur Quan Lee and Howard Finster, the Reverend Howard Finster. I don't know if you're familiar with Howard Finster, but he's a favorite of mine. But he also is a banjo picker like you are. But those are the three I collect. And this one, there are a number of things that appeal to me about it. But there's the tripart understanding that we see both in Scripture and in classical philosophy of the head, the heart, and the stomach. And you've got obedience over the abdomen.
Yeah,
which is where we have a lot of trouble.
Right.
That part of our body gives us a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
and then you have the flaming heart, which obviously the affections, the moral virtues exercise there, and then the eye that symbolizing insight. where it belongs. And then when you think about it, this is the way the kind of the hierarchy of a human being is supposed to work. A person who is well spiritually is oriented in this way, God's truth, wisdom, directing us. There you see the owl on the shoulder, obviously speaking to him. And then you have the heart, which of course is where a lot of the energy is, drawn from, in order to make sure that lower section stays obedient.
Yeah.
If you put the abdomen where the head belongs, you'd say that's not a well-ordered life. That's not a well-ordered person. So it's a beautiful image, and there's a lot more going on with that. I love the roots coming out of the foot at the bottom.
Yeah.
Anyway, anything else in particular about this image that you want to bring to the attention of viewers?
Well, there's so many things I can talk about. A lot of the tools. For example, he's holding a shovel. I have a good friend who's a farmer. His family's been wheat farmers in Kansas for 5 generations, and he carries a big. It's a huge operation, and he's kind of worked really hard to bring it. We have a funny relationship. I always laugh because I'm I'm kind of a podunk farmer, but he's always, we have these great conversations, and he's always really excited about the things that we're doing and trying. And
oh, nice.
And but one time when we first bought the land, when we expanded our farm, it'd be about 7 or 8 years ago, and he came down and he grabbed a shovel, and it was like the shovel just turned into something else. The minute when he picked it up, it ceased to be a normal tool, and it just became part of who he was. And we went on this walk, and we'd dig up some soil, and he'd have it in his hands, and he'd talk about everything that he saw there, and the structure, and all these different dynamics. And so it was such a beautiful thing to see that shovel to transcend itself, when he picked it up, and so there's a lot of things like that. The axe is a symbol that's always kind of
right
in my work a lot. And often that's, something we think about of like gathering, I think the word is tamid, where it's like the priestly kind of gathering of resources for the fire, in the temple, and so there's this idea of like, okay, what does it mean to be the one who stewards the resources that will become part of worship of God's people? And so the axe is kind of a symbol of that, so there's a lot of parts and pieces there.
Yeah, this is a rich one. So is this print still available for purchase, or did you sell it out?
No, I still have. They're still available. Yeah.
So this is a good segue to talk about how people can purchase your work. So you've got some websites. There's is the School of Transfer of Energy, is that where they go to buy, or is it Baumwork?
Baumwork shop is where you can go to buy prints. There's a link to it from the School of the Transfer of Energy. So that's, and then there we have a website for the farm as well, called Baumwork Farm. But Baumwork shop,
there's a lot
of work.
Another good place to keep up with you is on Instagram. We're connected there, and you're always posting, great stuff that's going on, in your life and on the farm. You're working right now on an egg tempura that's fascinating. Maybe we can finish with that. And we'll make sure that people in the show notes have a link to your Instagram page so they can follow that. But that's a pretty laborious piece of work that you're working on there, and I'm definitely going to get it. If you're going to have prints, I'm definitely going to get it.
Yeah, I'll make prints of that one for sure. It's a Zechariah, kind of the 3rd and 4th chapters of Zechariah, where the accuser is, accusing the high priest Joshua before in the council of heaven, and it kind of reminiscent of Job, the opening of Job, and and then
I loved your portrayal of the accuser.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great. What kind of bird was that? Did you just make them up, or is that a particular kind of bird?
Kind of a hybrid bird, but, a la Hieronymus Bosch.
Yeah.
If humans.
If somebody's a fan of Hieronymus Bosch, I think that they would find a lot of your work very appealing.
Yeah, I love Bosch.
Bosch is a big influence for sure. So.
Well, that's great. I actually have a friend whose name is Christian Cuthbert. We've had him on the show before, but he's a Jonathan Edwards scholar and kind of connected at Yale. And he saw some of your work, and he said, Bosch, I see Bosch in that guy.
That's tremendously gratifying. I'm happy.
Great. Anyway, we should wrap up. We've actually gone a little longer than we normally do, but it's been such a great time with you, Jack. And after we're done signing off, please stick around because I have a couple of questions for you. But anyway, is there anything you want to say just as we conclude?
Gosh, I don't know. I thank you, for having me on, and it's neat to have an opportunity to share, about what I'm doing, and so I'm certainly grateful for that, and I think, if anything, that I think a good friend of mine always talks about, he said that creativity is one of the highest forms of spiritual warfare that he knows of.
Wow.
And I'm really struck by that. And, and I think for me, it's a form of worship and a form of prayer, a form of relationship. It's a big tent, so to speak. So I hope people are encouraged. I know I do a lot of things, and it's kind of ridiculous. And I'm profoundly blessed by a supportive wife and family and community, lots of patient people, and a God who provides for me to be able to do these things. So it's not done in a vacuum.
And that's another theme of your work is provision with the flying fish. We didn't even get into that, but that's another thing. But anyway, we do need to end. Anyway, it's great to have you on the show, Jack, and maybe we'll have you back maybe in the future at some point to talk about some other things. By the way, if you are wondering where the music is from that we've been using in the show today, it's actually Jack. We're taking some of his music and using it for our intro and our whatever it's called. Outro. That's right. But we'll also have links to Jack's work in the show notes, maybe some articles and so forth that you could take a look at and learn a little more about Jack. But anyway, that's it for now. We appreciate all the folks who support the Theology Pugcast on a regular basis on Patreon and in other ways. And so anyway, we've gone on and on. So thanks again, Jack, and thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast. Bye-bye.
Bye.